أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين بارئ الخلائق أجمعين باعث الأنبياء والمرسلين ثم الصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا وحبيب قلوبنا أبي القاسم المصطفى محمد اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين أما بعد السلام عليكم جميعا ورحمة الله وبركاته. Alhamdulillah, we are continuing this evening with our conversation about the Qur'an and in particular the structure of the Qur'an. Last night we asked a very important question, and the question was, why is the Qur'an revealed in the Arabic language? If we can go to the first or the second slide, we see that the Qur'an itself informs us that it has been revealed in the Arabic language. Inna anzalnahu, we have revealed it, Qur'anan, a recitation, Arabiyyan, Arabic, la'allakum ta'aqilun, so that you may use your intellect, you may understand it, or through it you may understand some higher realities. And we saw that Arabiyan over here can take on two meanings. The first meaning of Arabiyan is that related to the Arab people, the language of the Arab people. And the second meaning of Arabiyan here could be that it is a book that is clear and a book that is eloquent. In any case, the Quran has been revealed in the Arabic language, and the question that we asked yesterday was, why out of all the languages in which the final message could be revealed, it was chosen to be revealed in the Arabic language? Now, there are a number of answers that have been given to this question. As I mentioned yesterday, some of the scholars have said that it has to be revealed in a particular language, and regardless of which language you reveal in, people may ask, well, why not in another language? Secondly, we also saw a principle from the Quran, where the Quran tells us that we never send a messenger unless, or we only send a messenger to speak in the language of his people, bilisani qawmihi. And therefore, the question became for us, why was the Prophet of Allah and the last messenger of Islam sent to the people of Arabia? And we looked at a number of reasons why that might have been. Some scholars like Shaykh Khabbaz, who is a contemporary speaker and a contemporary scholar, he states that one of the reasons why the Quran was revealed in Arabic and the Prophet of Allah came to the people of Arabia was because they made up a big part of the earth's population at that time, and no messenger had come to them. No prophet had come to them after Prophet Ibrahim and Prophet Ismail, and therefore they needed guidance, and they would not have accepted any other guidance, any other influence that would have come from other lands. We know that Arabia at that time bordered both the Roman Empire for centuries and also the Persian Empire for centuries. And both these empires were great civilizations. They had a lot of culture, a lot of thought in their history, but the people of Arabia chose not to accept their influence, and therefore the last message, or a messenger rather, was sent to them so that they would accept that guidance that had been given to them. But the point that we looked at last night is that the Arabic language is both a very rich and a very versatile language. We saw last night that the Quran had to have two properties. The first property is that the Quran had to describe very difficult concepts in a very accurate, very eloquent, and very precise manner. To take the beliefs, to take reality, to take ethical growth and ethical journeying, to take the laws, both social and individual, and describe them in a very clear manner. To use a technical term, to take that which is ma'qul, which is normally rationalized, that is understood through the intellect, and to make it mahsus, something that can be observed almost, and something that is easy to understand. And the second property that the Qur'an had to have is that statements of the Qur'an had to carry layers of meaning. They had to carry levels of meaning. The Qur'an could not be limited to a finite set of meanings. Otherwise, the Qur'an would not have remained an inspiration and a guidance for all of mankind. You see, Islam is the final religion, and the Qur'an is the last book that is going to come down through revelation. After that, there will be no other book that will come after the Qur'an. And people would have to take meaning, would have to take inspiration, would have to take guidance from the Qur'an. Therefore, it had to carry multiple layers of meaning within it. There's a very beautiful hadith where one of the companions of our Imam, as I mentioned yesterday, Ibn Sikkit. Ibn Sikkit was a student of the 10th Imam. Ibn Sikkit was known not only for teaching the Qur'an, but for being a master in the Arabic language and in Arabic words. He says, I asked the 10th Imam, ما بال القرآن? What is it with the nature of the Qur'an? لا يزداد على النشر والدرس إلا غضاضة. That no matter how much you teach it and no matter how much you propagate it, people never get tired of it. It never becomes dull. To the contrary, it increases in freshness. قال عليه السلام, the Imam said, إن الله تعالى, the Almighty, لم يجعله لزمان دون زمان. He hasn't made it for one period of time and not another period of time. ولا لناس دون ناس. Nor has he made it for one group of people. For example, only to answer to the needs of the people of the 7th century in Arabia. No, this Qur'an is supposed to answer to the needs of all the cultures living at that time and living until today and living after today as well. Meaning this Qur'an that has a finite set of statements is supposed to have almost an infinite set of meanings within it. فَهُوَ فِي كُلِّ زَمَانٍ جَدِيدٍ. Therefore, in every era, it is going to be new. وَعِنْدَ كُلِّ قَوْمٍ غَضٌّ إِلَى يَوْمِ الْقِيَامَةِ. And with every community, they will find a freshness, meaning they will find the Qur'an speaks to them until the day of judgment. With these two properties, one being accurate and rich in description, and the second one being profound and having depth in presentation, we find that one of the languages that can satisfy these two characteristics is the Arabic language. Now, yesterday we looked at the richness of the Arabic language and the number of words and the differences, the subtle differences within those words that give rise to a lot of meaning. Today we want to look at the versatility of the Arabic language. So if we can go to the 4th slide, we find that it has the ability to take a simple set of words or a finite set of words and provide a lot of meaning to it, both in the words and also in the structure of the Arabic language. Let's look at a word in the Arabic language, like the word mizan. Mizan meaning scale. Now, the Quran uses the word mizan to describe the scales on the day of judgment. فَمَنْ ثَقُلَتْ مَوَازِينُهُ. And the one whose scales are heavy. And then later the Quran says, وَمَنْ خَفَّتْ مَوَازِينُهُ. And the one whose scales are light. Now, for a long time, and for many people, they look at that, they imagine the scales used to weigh, for example, fruits and vegetables. And they may think that we have scales like that for weighing good deeds and bad deeds on the day of judgment. But then some people think, and they say, well, how can that be? Good deeds and bad deeds are not like apples and oranges to be weighed. So Allama Tabatabai in Tafsir al-Mizan, he says, well, there is a richness or versatility to words in the Arabic language. Let's look at the root meaning of Mizan. And he looks at the root meaning of Mizan, not just the common usage. And he says in the root meaning of Mizan, it is actually a tool for measurement. And then depending on what we want to measure, the tool will look different, will take a different form. So for example, remember in the Arabic language, Mizan in its root meaning is a tool for measurement. Now, if you want to measure weight, then it's a balance scale. If you want to measure temperature, then that's a thermometer. And if you want to measure, for example, distance, well, then that's a measuring stick or something of that nature, a measuring tape, for example. Right? Similarly, on the day of judgment, if we want to measure good deeds and bad deeds, then there must be a scale that is appropriate, a tool that is appropriate for measuring good deeds and bad deeds. And the Quran gives us a hint towards that. And the Quran says, وَالْوَزْنُ يَوْمَئِذٍ الْحَقِّ. On that day, the weight will be the truth. Now, the person who looks at it with a very simple manner is able to take meaning from it, is able to organize his life and feel a sense of responsibility. And similarly, a person who is thinking and intellecting and philosophizing, when he looks at this verse, he too can take another layer of meaning from it, because that's how versatile the language is. In fact, the language has an ability to take a lot of meaning and compact it into very simple words or very simple structures, right? One of the scholars that speaks about this is Shaykh Fawzi. And the example that he gives, he says, take, for example, a verb in the, take, for example, a verb from the Arabic language, like kataba, meaning he wrote. And let's say you want to make it passive, meaning you want to say it was written. In Arabic, that's very easy. You simply state kutiba. You change two harakat, and with that ease, you have written it was written. Whereas in English, you would have to add so many words to be able to say the same thing. Then in the Arabic language, you can take the same word and put it into different standard formats. Now, I don't wish to go through the syntax or the morphology in Arabic, but just to give you a simple example, for example, غَلِقَ meaning to be closed. أَغْلَقَ, he closed. But then when you want to say something was closed tightly, firmly, you say غَلَّقَ. And all you have done is add an extra lam to it. غَلَّقَ. But غَلَّقَ doesn't just mean to close something. It means to firmly close it. Now, where does this help us? This helps us when we read the Surah of Yusuf, when Zulaykha calls and seduces Yusuf, and she closes the door. The Quran says, وَرَاوَدَتْهُ الَّتِي هُوَ فِي بَيْتِهَا. And the one in whose house he was in, she seduced him. وَغَلَّقَتِ الْأَبْوَابَ. And she closed firmly the doors. Just by looking at this verb, غَلَّقَتْ, the scholars say she closed it firmly. And to have closed it firmly, she would have put a lock on it. So she locked it, and she locked many doors so that nobody would have entry in and nobody could have entry out. That simple statement of غَلَّقَتْ carried so much meaning in it. Well, that is the nature of the Quran, and that is the nature of the Arabic language. Now today, inshallah, we would like to look at another question related to the previous conversation that we had, and that is the Quran and the culture of the people of Arabia. Now, perhaps the slides for today may not be aligning with what I have to say, so you may not perhaps pay attention to the slides, but inshallah, we will be able to present this without the slides. And inshallah, we might share the slides with you a little later. But the question we want to look at today is that when the Quran used the Arabic language, obviously it used words and structures from the Arabic language, but we also see the Quran uses expressions from the Arabic language. And I'll give you a few examples right now. The Quran used the cultural environment of the people of Arabia. It in some cases uses cultural expressions amongst the people of Arabia. And it refers to the things that were common amongst the people of Arabia. Okay? And I'll give you some examples. And then I'll come to the question that this raises. So for example, when the Quran wants to describe paradise, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes paradise as a place which is green, which is lush, which has water flowing in it, which has, for example, nice places of living in it, which has good food in it. And I know that some of you have thought about this question, or you've been asked this question, but isn't this paradise as it would have been imagined by a person living in Arabia in the 7th century? Aren't these things that appeal to them? For example, the Quran says, Hur, who are going to be Hur maqsuratun fil khiyam, Huris that are secluded in the khiyam. And khiyam is the plural of khayma, khayma meaning tent. And even when the Quran describes the Huris, it says, وَحُورٌ عِينٌ, these ladies which have big eyes, for example. Aren't these things which are appealing to the people of Arabia within that particular culture? They used to use tents, for example. They had a particular view of what made a lady appealing or not. Would that also be appealing to people of other culture? Would that also be appealing to people, for example, of today's society? Another example is that the Quran, when it speaks about modes of transportation, or for example, what people of Arabia would desire, it speaks about camels and horses, and it speaks about donkeys as well. Now, that would appeal to people at that time, but would it appeal to people living today? And those people who are reciting the Quran today and they are reflecting upon the Quran today, would that be of relevance to them? Another example, not only referring to things which are found in Arabia, but also expressions and perhaps to some extent beliefs or practices of people who lived in Arabia. For example, when the Quran wants to speak about interest, and it wants to deter people from taking interest, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says those who take interest are like those who exact usury will not stand, but like the one deranged by the devil's touch. الذي يتخبطه الشيطان من المس. A person when they couldn't walk properly because they were deranged or they weren't feeling well, then they would say that this person has been touched by shaitan. And perhaps they were implying at that time that such a person, they are not able to think properly or they're not able to behave properly, not because there would be something naturally wrong with them, but because shaitan or the jinn has had an influence or an impact upon them. And this raises a lot of questions. But the question that we want to look at today is that the Quran, which uses Arabic expressions, which uses statements which were relevant in 7th century Arabia, how can that Quran then be a book of universal guidance? How can it be relevant to somebody who is reciting it in the 21st century, or somebody, for example, who is reciting it in North America or in Greenland and the North Pole, for example, right? So that's the question that we would like to look at today. Now, there are a number of responses that have been given to this question. The first response that Sheikh Munir al-Khabbaz posits to say that, well, the expressions of Arab culture in the Quran, whilst there are such expressions over there, they are very much limited in the Quran. They do not predominate the Quran. They are not prevalent in the Quran. For example, there are about or around 6,200 or so verses in the Quran. There are different counts of the verses depending on whether some verses are seen as one verse or two separate verses. But let's take around 6,200 verses. Out of these verses, about 20 to 30, let's say 50 of these verses, make reference to expressions that were culturally bound to the people of Arabia. Let's say they make reference to things which would only be known to the people of Arabia or be prevalent in their lives. No, let's take it from 50 to 200. Well, 200 verses out of 6,200 or so verses only makes up 3 to 4% of the Quran. Indeed, if it was 30 to 20% of the Quran, then we would say that 30 to 20% of the Quran seems not to be directly relevant or easily accessible to people who are not from Arab culture. But when it's only 3 to 4%, it does not have a great impact upon the message of the Quran as understood by the rest of humanity. But the second point that he raises is very important, and we have to understand it step by step. See, the Quran has to speak to multiple audiences. It has an immediate audience, and the immediate audience of the Quran are the people of 7th century Arabia. Sometimes the immediate audience of the Quran were the family of the Holy Prophet. And we have to remember that the message of the Holy Prophet went in stages. The Prophet of Allah was first told, وَأَنذِرْ عَشِيرَتَكَ الْأَقْرَبِينَ, O Prophet, warn your closest relatives. At that time, the Quran, which is spoken word, as we're going to see, the Quran was speaking to the close family of the Holy Prophet. And then after a while, the Prophet of Allah was told, now spread this message to all of the people of Arabia, لِتُنذِرَ أُمَّ الْقُرَى وَمَنْ حَوْلَهَا, so that you may warn the people of Mecca and those who are around Mecca, or the people of Arabia and those who are around the people of Arabia. And then the Prophet of Allah is told, وَمَا أَرْسَلْنَاكَ إِلَّا رَحْمَةً لِلْعَالَمِينَ, O Prophet, we have not sent you but a mercy, meaning a guide to all of mankind. So the Quran has an immediate audience, and that immediate audience are the people of 7th century Arabia. And the Quran has to address them. The Quran has to speak to them. The Quran has to be inspiring to them. The Quran has to be relevant to them. After all, they are the ones who are going to then take the message of the Quran and spread it east and west. If they are not inspired by the Quran, if the Quran does not touch their lives and does not change their societies, then who is going to spread that message to the east and to the west? So the Quran has, number one, an immediate audience, and then the Quran has a general audience, which is all of humanity for all time to come. So the Quran must speak to both. Now we know that whenever we address a specific audience that come from a specific culture, sometimes using expressions from their culture, which although are culturally bounded to them, can be very impactful in conveying the message to them, in inspiring them, in mobilizing them. Now, I'll give you an example from present day in Canada. So let's imagine that the Premier of Nova Scotia wants to inspire his community to stay home during the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic. And let's imagine for a moment, then he later wants his community, people of his province, then to inspire the rest of Canada. So he has got a general audience who are Canadians in general. Some of this is hypothetical. And he's got a specific audience, a direct and immediate audience. And those are the people of Nova Scotia. So sometimes he may use expressions which only Nova Scotians, for example, as you may have heard in the news, he used this term and I don't understand it, or I have not found it out to be an obscene term. He said to them, stay the blazes home, for example. And it struck a chord with them. And it mobilized them. It inspired them. So sometimes one has to use expressions that may be relevant to one culture to mobilize and to inspire them. And that's what the Quran did. Therefore, you find in the Quran, there are expressions limited, which are culturally bound, and we can still benefit from them by researching what it meant to the people of Arabia. And then in the Quran, we find that there are expressions which are universal expressions, which are general expressions. These are the majority of the expressions of the Quran, and these apply to all of humanity. So to give you one quick example before we end our session for today, we talk about paradise. The Quran describes paradise in a manner that, yes, would appeal to people in 7th century Arabia. And then the Quran also describes paradise in a manner that would appeal to all of humanity, that would appeal to people past and present. So yes, the Quran does speak about greenery and water. And by the way, greenery and water is appealing to all of humanity. I am sure that even us living today, whether it's in the West Coast or in the East Coast, the sight of water and the blueness of water does make us calm, does give us comfort and serenity. And then there are expressions in the Quran which are universally appealing. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describing Jannah in the Quran, He says, فِيهِ مَا تَشْتَهِ الْأَنفُسُ وَتَلَظُّ الْأَعْيُنُ. In the Quran, in Jannah, are things which the heart desires and that which brings joy to the eyes. So whatever a person finds appealing, whatever they find brings joy to their heart, whatever they find is appealing to their sight, that also will be found in Jannah as well. Now, inshallah, we'll look at one or two more examples tomorrow evening of where there are culturally bound expressions which are in the minority in the Quran, and then there are universal expressions which are in the majority in the Quran. And therefore, in that sense, the Quran is able to inspire its immediate audience, but at the same time remain relevant and no longer remain culturally bound, but to remain relevant to the rest of humanity, past and present. We pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He give us the continued tawfiq to understand the styles and to understand the messages of the Quran. And we pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give us the tawfiq to act upon the teachings of the Holy Book. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.